Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Whispering Path. The Appalachian Mountains had always been a draw for thrill seekers, nature enthusiasts, and those desperate to leave their daily lives behind, even if just for a weekend. For Jake, Melanie, Eric, and Lisa, it was a spontaneous decision. Jake, the self-proclaimed adventurer of the group, suggested they try an unmarked trail he'd read about on a sketchy hiking forum. The promise of untouched beauty and a challenge no one else had dared to take was irresistible, at least to him. The others, reluctant but intrigued, agreed. By mid-morning, they were deep into the forest, the canopy of leaves casting dappled shadows over their path. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of boots on fallen leaves and the occasional bird call. Jake led the way, his GPS in hand. Melanie followed close behind, her eyes scanning for wildlife. Eric, the joker, occasionally broke the silence with exaggerated bear growls, much to Lisa's irritation. "This is amazing," Jake said, grinning. "See? Told you this trail would be worth it." "Yeah, if we don't get lost," Lisa muttered, adjusting her backpack. The first sign of trouble came late in the afternoon. The trail had grown faint, barely more than a suggestion of flattened grass and disturbed undergrowth. The GPS signal wavered and cut out entirely. Jake frowned, tapping the screen as if that would bring the map back. "Relax," he said when Lisa voiced her concern. "We just need to head west. Worst case, we camp here tonight and head back in the morning." "That's not reassuring," Melanie said, glancing at the lengthening shadows. As dusk fell, the forest seemed to close in around them. The air grew heavy, and the once soothing rustle of leaves took on an unsettling quality. Then they came across it, a massive oak tree with deep carvings etched into its bark. Eyes, dozens of them, each staring outward with eerie precision. "What the hell is this?" Eric asked, stepping closer. Melanie shuddered. "It's probably some kind of prank." Jake touched one of the carvings, running his fingers over the grooves. The bark felt unusually warm, almost pulsing beneath his fingertips. He snatched his hand back. "Let's keep moving," he said, suddenly uneasy. They trudged on, the tension among them growing with every step. An hour later, they found themselves back at the same tree. "You got to be kidding me," Lisa said, her voice rising. "We just walked in a circle. I'm sure it's just a coincidence," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. Eric pointed to the carvings. "Those weren't there before." They looked closer. The eyes were different now, sharper, almost angry. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. Melanie grabbed Jake's arm. "Let's get out of here. Now." But the whispers began. Faint at first, just a rustle of sound carried on the wind. Then clearer, a voice, low and insistent, calling Eric's name. "Did you hear that?" Eric asked, spinning around. "Hear what?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. Eric didn't answer. Instead, he started walking toward the sound, his steps slow and deliberate. "Eric, where are you going?" Jake shouted. Melanie and Lisa ran after him, their flashlights bouncing wildly in the growing darkness. They found him standing stock still in front of another tree. This one had a single carving, a humanoid figure. Its face was an exact replica of Eric's. "Eric, we have to go," Melanie pleaded, grabbing his arm. He didn't respond. His eyes were glassy, his face slack. It took all three of them to drag him away, and even then, he kept looking back at the tree, murmuring something under his breath. The forest seemed to shift around them as they tried to leave. Every path led them back to the oak tree, the carvings now depicting grotesque versions of themselves. Melanie's image had her screaming, her mouth stretched unnaturally wide. Lisa's showed her lying on the ground, her eyes hollow sockets. Jake's carving depicted him running, hands outstretched, as if fleeing something unseen. Panic set in. They ran blindly, Eric stumbling along with them, until the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. Somehow, they found their way back to their campsite. Relief turned to horror when they saw it. Their tent was shredded, their supplies scattered and destroyed. The same symbol from the oak tree was slashed into every surface. "We're leaving," Jake said, his voice firm. No one argued. They hiked back in silence, Eric snapping out of his daze only when they reached the trailhead. None of them spoke of what had happened, not on the drive home, not in the days or weeks that followed. They simply drifted apart, bound by a shared terror they refused to acknowledge. To this day, none of them have returned to the woods. But sometimes, late at night, Melanie swears she hears whispers outside her window, faint and insistent, calling her name. Story 2. The Echoing Cry. Logan Hart was the kind of man who sought silence. An accountant by trade, he spent most of his days buried in numbers and deadlines, suffocated by the buzz of city life. Hiking was his escape, his meditation. That's why, on a chilly October morning, he found himself deep in the Pacific Northwest wilderness, where the only sounds were the crunch of his boots on pine needles and the occasional rustle of unseen animals in the underbrush. The trail was sparsely marked, but Logan prided himself on his sense of direction. He had a map, a compass, and a backpack full of essentials. The forest enveloped him, its towering firs and cedars blotting out the sky. There was no cell service here, and that was part of the appeal. No emails, no phone calls, just peace, or so he thought. About an hour into his hike, Logan heard it, a faint cry. At first, he thought it was a bird, but the sound was unmistakably human. A distant, high-pitched plea for help. He froze, heart hammering in his chest. The sound came again, clearer this time. "Help me." He looked around but saw nothing except the endless expanse of trees. Every instinct told him to stay on the trail. He'd read the horror stories of hikers vanishing after straying off course. But this was different. Someone was in trouble. He couldn't ignore that. "Hello," Logan called out, his voice swallowed by the forest. "Where are you?" The cry came again, a little louder, a little closer. He stepped off the trail, weaving through the trees. His boots sank into soft moss as he moved deeper, the light dimming with every step. The forest seemed to grow denser, the air colder. He checked his compass. North. He'd keep heading north and mark his way back if he didn't find the source of the cries. But the farther he went, the more the forest seemed to shift around him. The cries grew louder but stayed just out of reach, like a cruel game of hide and seek. An hour passed, then another. The trees seemed taller here, their branches gnarled and twisted like arthritic fingers. Shadows stretched long and deep, and the once crisp air turned heavy, oppressive. Logan stopped to catch his breath, hands on his knees. His watch told him it was nearing 4 p.m., but the dim light made it feel like twilight. The cries had stopped. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves. Not even the sound of his own breathing seemed to break the silence. And that's when he saw her. She was standing about 50 feet away, partially obscured by a tree. A woman, pale as moonlight, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the dim light around her. Her hair hung limp and stringy, and her clothes looked like they belonged to another century, a tattered dress that barely clung to her emaciated frame. Logan's breath caught in his throat. "Are you okay?" he asked, stepping closer. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised one skeletal hand and pointed behind him. Logan turned, and his stomach dropped. There, not far in the distance, was a cabin. He hadn't seen it before, and yet it seemed old, out of place. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney, a strange contrast to the lifeless silence of the woods. When he turned back to the woman, she was gone. Logan's rational mind screamed at him to leave, to find the trail and head back to his car. But something about the cabin tugged at him. Maybe it was the smoke, a sign of life. Someone had to be inside. Maybe they knew what was going on. He approached cautiously, his every step feeling heavier than the last. The door was slightly ajar, creaking open with the slightest touch. The interior was dim, lit only by the dying embers of a fire in the hearth. The cabin smelled of damp wood and something metallic, like rust or blood. On a small, rickety table sat a single photograph. Logan's blood ran cold when he picked it up. It was a picture of him, taken that very day. In the photo, he was standing on the trail, smiling, completely unaware. Logan dropped the photo and stumbled back. The cabin felt like it was closing in on him. The shadows grew darker, the air thicker. He bolted out the door and ran, blind to the branches clawing at his face and arms. He didn't care about direction anymore. He just needed to get away. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsing onto the ground. When he looked up, he saw the familiar marker of the trailhead. Relief washed over him, and he staggered back to his car, vowing never to speak of what had happened. But even now, months later, Logan can't escape the cries. They follow him in his dreams, in the quiet moments of his day. And sometimes, when he's alone at night, he hears them again, faint and distant, calling his name from the darkness. Somewhere out there, the forest still waits, and so does she. Story 3, The Moving Lights. Anna and Jake were the kind of couple everyone envied. Young, adventurous, and deeply in love, they often sought solace in the great outdoors, far from the noise of their busy city lives. This weekend, they had decided on a remote forest in the heart of Vermont, a place that promised untouched wilderness and a blanket of stars unmatched by any city skyline. They arrived late in the afternoon, their backpacks filled with supplies and hearts brimming with excitement. The trail was quiet, the kind of quiet that settled under your skin and made the world feel still. By dusk, they'd found the perfect spot, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. Jake pitched the tent while Anna collected firewood, and soon they were sitting by a crackling fire, sipping cheap wine from tin cups. The first orb appeared just as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. "Did you see that?" Anna asked, pointing toward the trees. Jake looked up from his cup. "What?" "That light. Over there." She stood, squinting into the growing darkness. A faint glow, like the shimmer of a dying flashlight, danced between the trees. "It's probably just fireflies," she said, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. But fireflies didn't move like that. The light didn't flicker randomly, but seemed deliberate, almost playful, as it darted through the forest. Another orb appeared, then another, each one joining the first in a slow, hypnotic dance. They formed patterns, circles, spirals, shapes that seemed almost intentional. "That's not normal," Jake said, standing now. His voice was low, cautious. Anna's curiosity outweighed her fear. "Let's follow them." Jake hesitated, but the look in her eyes was all it took. He grabbed a flashlight, though its beam felt weak against the growing darkness, and they stepped off the trail, moving toward the lights. The forest swallowed them whole. The tall pines seemed to press closer together, their branches clawing at the sky. The ground was soft with moss and littered with fallen leaves, muffling their footsteps. The lights danced ahead, always just out of reach, leading them deeper and deeper. "Maybe we should turn back," Jake said after a while. His voice cracked, betraying his nerves. "Just a little further," Anna replied, her gaze fixed on the glowing orbs. They had become brighter, more vivid, casting eerie shadows on the trees. And then, suddenly, the forest opened up. They stood in a clearing surrounded by ancient stones, their surfaces weathered and covered in moss. The lights hovered above the stones, pulsating like living, breathing things. A cold wind swept through the clearing, and with it came a sound, low, guttural, like the hum of a deep, ancient chant. It seemed to rise from the ground, vibrating through their bodies. "Anna," Jake whispered, grabbing her arm. "We need to go. Now." But when they turned, the path they had come from was gone. In its place was a wall of trees, their gnarled branches weaving together like a living barrier. The lights began to move faster, circling them, flickering wildly. The chant grew louder, more insistent, and the air grew colder, so cold that their breath came out in visible puffs. "What is this?" Anna cried, her voice barely audible over the noise. Jake didn't answer. He was staring at the lights, his face pale. And then, without warning, one of the orbs shot toward him, enveloping him in a blinding flash of light. When the light faded, Jake was gone. Anna screamed, her voice raw and desperate. She spun in circles, calling his name, but there was no response. The lights had stopped moving, hovering silently around her, their glow almost mocking. She stumbled backward, tripping over a root, and fell to the ground. Tears streamed down her face as she crawled to her feet. She didn't know how, but she started running, crashing through the forest. Branches tore at her clothes, scratched her skin, but she didn't stop. The chant still echoed in her ears, growing fainter with each step, until finally she burst onto the trailhead. A search team found her hours later, disoriented and covered in scratches. When they asked what had happened, her story spilled out in fragmented bursts. The lights, the stones, the chant, and Jake's disappearance. The lead searcher frowned. "Jake," he asked, "your boyfriend? He reported you missing 2 days ago. Said you'd wandered off during a hike. We've been looking for you since." Anna stared at him, her mind reeling. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible. He was with me. He disappeared. But there was no trace of Jake. Not on the trail, not in the forest, not anywhere. The only thing the searchers found was their campsite, undisturbed, as if they had never been there at all." Anna never returned to the woods. She moved back to the city, tried to rebuild her life, but the memories lingered. And sometimes, late at night, she swore she could see faint orbs of light flickering outside her window, as if they were waiting for her to follow them once more.